Okay, well, good afternoon. My name's Maureen Conway. I'm the Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program here at the Aspen Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here for this afternoon's book talk on mistakes to success, learning and adapting when things go wrong. I'm sure many of you have not yet gotten the chance to read it, but I just want to say that it's a fascinating collection of papers. And I not only have had the chance to read it, but also got the chance to participate in a couple of discussion meetings about the papers when they were in draft form. And it's a particularly interesting collection of papers on a variety of different types of community development projects. And it covers child care projects and commercial real estate development project that you'll hear about a little bit more about today, but it also covered workforce development projects and asset building projects and a variety of things. And it was interesting to see how some different themes of capacity building, managing multiple goals, and the complexity of the work came up in these different contexts, and you could sort of take a cut at them from different angles. So we had some really rich discussions around sort of the mistakes and what can be learned, and how do you think about whether a project is or isn't a mistake, and when do you call it, and because of this issue of multiple goals, you make success on some and not others maybe. So we had just had a really interesting discussion grappling with the complexity of these issues and how to think about them, and most importantly, how to learn from them and use them to build the field. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to replicate a little bit of that interesting discussion here with you this afternoon. So I am going to try to get us started reasonably quickly. So I will first introduce our panelists. Today we have Bob Giloth, many of you may know, Vice President, Center for Family Economic Success at the Annie Casey Foundation. And he's directed CDCs in Baltimore and Chicago, and also served as Deputy Commissioner of Economic Development in the City of Chicago. He writes extensively about community economic development, and he also managed the Casey Jobs Initiative and was site team leader for the startup of the Making Connections site. So he's not only the editor of the volume that we're talking about today, but he also has 2 papers in there as well. Neil Kleiman is Director of Research at Living Cities, and beginning in February, he will become the director of a new center at New York University focused on integrative research and policy development. He was formerly Vice President for Policy at CEDCO, and he's the founding director of Center for an Urban Future, a nonprofit public policy institute working on issues of economic and workforce development in New York City. And Bob Brehm served as Executive Director of Bickerdike Redevelopment Corporation from 1978 through 1984, and since then has taught practitioners in community and organizational development and consulted for community groups. So what we'd like to do this afternoon, we're going to start with Bob Giloth, who's going to do this is going to get confusing, isn't it? Who's going to do sort of our formal part of our presentation today. He has a few slides to go through to sort of frame our conversation around mistakes, the kind of mistakes we're talking about, and sort of why he came to this frame for thinking about community projects. And then what we want to do is we want to have Neil and Bob Brehm share a little bit of their particular story that they're talking about, so that you'll have the story and the context of what happened in those situations. I'll ask them some questions, and then I want to make sure to leave some time, plenty of time at the end, because I know many of you will have questions and want to join this conversation and have the opportunity to share your own mistakes if you'd like. But so we want to make sure we have plenty of time to engage you in this conversation as well. So just on the logistics end, just briefly, we would like to treat this for the most part as an informal discussion. If you need to go out and come in, get some food or whatever, that's fine. But do please be aware that we are filming. So just to be aware of that, and also if you could please silence your phones just for everybody's benefit, that would be great. And so with that, I will turn it over to Bob to start things off.
Thanks, Maureen. And thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. First, I'd just like to thank Maureen and Aspen for hosting this event, and also my co-editor, Colin from MDC in North Carolina, who really helped put together the chapters in the book and has a chapter in there as well. What I want to do in just a few minutes is give a brief overview of the book. And then, as Maureen said, we'll hear two mistake stories. And what I'll be arguing is that sharing mistakes, in my mind, is a good thing, particularly in the nonprofit arena, but in many other areas. And it's especially good as a prompt and a guide for learning and redesign. It's not just outing mistakes, it's about getting better, improving your game. Now, I won't cover all the issues involved in the book. That would be a big mistake that I'll avoid. But I'll share enough just to get you started about how to think about the mistakes world. And let me begin by saying, in the words of John Gardner, that we pay a heavy price for our fear of failure, and it's a powerful obstacle, that fear, to growth. Mistakes to success, as I can do it. As Maureen said, is a compilation of stories gathered in two rounds over the last couple of years. It's community economic development. Most of the chapters are workforce, but there's some on assets, community development. But there's also some about policy, some about organization building. They really cover different stages of innovation and implementation. When you're getting ready, the design process in the early stages. How do you think about best practices? How do you invest in outcomes? Managing change and complexity. So there's 12 stories. For the most part, these stories aren't macro strategies or policies. I describe them as more on-the-ground programs and policies of modest size. Now, I got into the mistakes business really in some ways because of peculiarities of the Casey Foundation. We tend to invest for 5, 6, 10 years in different initiatives, and we keep program officers connected to those initiatives. So unless you're really stupid, your mistakes and your successes, the rise and fall of initiatives kind of stare you in the face, and if you're interested and curious, you get involved in those. And that's certainly what got me thinking about mistakes and learning as I watched my colleagues on the ground trying to work in jobs work. So what I want to do in a few minutes is a quick summary of Chapter 1. This is a primer on learning from mistakes. But let me just emphasize that this is not just about the nonprofit sector. I know you know that, but I just want to emphasize it's certainly about the private sector, and I'll use a lot of examples from there, and also about the public sector as well. And there's no better way to start than, we've all seen this before, and luckily the Wright brothers learned from their mistakes, and in 1903 actually figured out how to fly. Interestingly, Wilbur Wright didn't think he would ever learn to fly in his lifetime. He was so having so many failures, but they do, if you stick with it, they do produce success, and that's a lesson in itself. This kind of question, what is success, kind of is the other side of the coin of what is failure, and in my mind, focusing on success has reminders, and the mistakes guru, a civil engineer named Henry Petrosky, says, things that succeed teach us little beyond the fact that they have been successful. Things that fail provide incontrovertible evidence that the limits of design have been exceeded. Emulating success risks failure. Studying failure increases our chances of success. Now, someone with a strong practitioner background, I've always found my mistakes more motivating than my successes. Maybe I've had more of them, so it was just, that's a probability statement. But it's always been more interesting to me what didn't go right, what assumptions were kind of wrong-headed in retrospect. And oftentimes there is a virtue to embarrassment. It rivets your attention unless you're completely blind. But I think we need to be real about this. We do want success. And for those of you who saw the Washington Post last week, there was an article titled, Errors by Air Traffic Controllers Set Record, 52 Mistakes in D.C. Region last year. Now, we'll no doubt learn a lot from these mistakes, but I just have to say that I, for one, would prefer more success in this domain, not more mistakes. And I think this points to the fact that there are lots of different kinds of mistakes in different domains of human endeavor. Some are about implementation, some are about innovation, some are about what we might call zero-tolerance work, things like flying planes, we hope in the healthcare system, operating nuclear plants, landing planes on aircraft carriers. And these are all things that we'd hope that there are very, very few mistakes. In mistakes to success, we focus on something we call constructive mistakes versus non-constructive mistakes. And this is a little blurry, but I think it's an important distinction. That is, a constructive mistake is where you've really done all your homework, marshaled all the knowledge, all the theory, you've made some good choices, and still things don't work out. And this very often is the case where you're involved in what in the social policy world we often call wicked problems, problems where we're not exactly sure about cause and effect of different factors. Even our social values may be in conflict. So we're almost always going to not get it right the first time or maybe even the second time. But these are constructive because if we really try our best and learn from them, we can really move forward. A good example of this is documented in one of the chapters on the Earned Income Tax Credit authored by Kirsten Moy of Aspen and Amy Brown, now of Ford. And their chapter is about the fallacy of thinking that and this is a fallacy lots of us hold in the investor world, that pilot projects necessarily or even generally lead to scale level change. And in fact, they show that sometimes when you start with a mentality around a pilot project, that's where you stay. You stay small, you can't get big. You didn't do the kind of thinking about scale that you need. And in fact, there are, some of the assumptions about scaling were faulty in those pilot projects. Now, what that led them to do was rethink scale, and they came up with something called the EITC technology platform, which is a web-based platform where EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit campaigns around the country, can access products and services, instruction, training, and so on. So it's a really good example of that. A big problem we face in the nonprofit sector and more broadly is that sharing mistakes can have some real consequences. And therefore, we hide the mistakes. And in fact, several authors in the process of putting together these sessions dropped out when their executive directors got wind of their chapter writing. And some groups, they only do success, and that's that. There's no more to be said about it. But this kind of reluctance is a function in part of investors and funders, for good and bad reasons. There is an image problem sometimes in the nonprofit sector. There's a question about whether there's a real focus on results. And at least in my sense, I think investors, meaning philanthropy, public sector, private sector, really need to lead the way in creating the space to share mistakes in the nonprofit sector. It's almost too much to expect that individual groups, although there's lots of exceptions, are going to do that by themselves. I think overall within philanthropy over the last 3 or 4 years, I've at least seen more openness to this kind of discussion at major meetings, trainings, and so on. So I think we're heading in the right direction. 2 types of mistakes run through a lot of the stories in the book, and I'm going to say a few things about each. I think there's a lot we can do to minimize these mistakes as well as learn from them. And the first is that we have, and by we I mean philanthropy in particular, but also the public sector, we just have a big insatiable appetite for complexity. We believe that's the nature of change. We want to be audacious. We want to be bold. And, realistically, in fact, a lot of the problems we grapple with are complex. one of the things we're doing now at Casey is we're reflecting on a lot of our community change, community development initiatives over 20 years. And I have to say it's been startling in retrospect to look at the complexity we took on. Like, what were we thinking doing that? And then we not only start with complexity, we'd get halfway through and we'd add another layer of complexity. That wasn't enough. There's a lot of positives to say for that, but I think we need to figure out, and these chapters grapple with this, the right balance between focus and complexity and sequencing and how much you take on and the right capacity to do this. The second challenge is evident in our stories that we don't do a good enough job with feasibility studies, and maybe you'll recognize some of these little stories here from the private sector. We don't do enough before we make investments. Here are two cases where they probably did extensive market analysis, yet bombed overnight. Get that one, Gap. I think they changed it within a few days. We need to do a lot better job in setting standards for the kinds of feasibility studies we do at the outset, while acknowledging that there's real complexity. It's not a foolproof methodology. In addition, we need to do a better job at assessing the capacities that are needed with our partners, with our investors on the ground to ensure that certain projects move in the right direction. And I have a chapter in particular that focuses on site selection. And in some ways, this is one of the most important, if you've ever done this, it's one of the most important issues. And some people will say the site you pick determines, 50, 60, 70% of how you'll do. And yet, we don't write about it. What have we learned about site selection? We've just going through that again with promised neighborhoods, choice neighborhoods. What have we really learned about that? What sites can make it work? Another big challenge is related to timing, and this is timing in local sites, in the marketplace, in the life of an organization, a community, a policy, an administration. We often say that projects succeed or fail because of timing, but we don't always do a really good job at the outset trying to understand the specifics of timing for individual investments and activities, while acknowledging that things just happen and we're going to have to adapt. And we need to ask, when is a success, and when does a mistake really become a mistake? Again, one of my chapters on sector-based workforce development looks at this strategy over 30 years, and frankly, it's been up and down in the evaluation world, and a lot of people stuck with it, and there's some new evidence Maureen's been involved with that's stronger than ever, but you really need to stick with these things a long time. And sometimes we stick with bad ideas too long, and sometimes we abandon good ideas too early. But that's a hard one to figure out. So mistakes to success, am I going the right direction here? Yeah. Makes a couple of recommendations for sort of building more interest in sharing mistakes and sort of a methodology. The first one is a tool that's interestingly called a pre-mortem. And this is where you assess risks before you start, not afterward. And there's a series of questions that you grapple with on the front end to really, not only taking a hard look at your project, but also training yourself and your colleagues about what to look for. Because the thing you want to do is catch mistakes as they're happening, not after the dust is cleared and the evaluation is in 5 years later. A second thing we recommend is to spend the time, the energy, sometimes the pain for changing the culture around sharing mistakes. And this is kind of essential if we're going to learn. And we've had some luck convening investors and nonprofits to do this in Casey and with other funders. And it's actually been a little bit liberating to say what our work really is about and what frustrates us and what gets us going and what we're worried about. And in fact, sharing mistakes often gets us to talk about our implicit knowledge, what we learn, what we know about working on the ground versus what we kind of rhetorically say is going on. Not that they're totally disconnected, but that implicit knowledge, those judgment calls, those intuitions that we have, this kind of training leads you to that. The best mistake stories are when we learn something and then we change our investment approach. You know, those are the best ones. We like that's the happy ending story. They're not all that way. Sometimes we make a mistake and we'll suffer with it. I'm still having bad dreams about a nonprofit construction company that failed in 1978. But you know that you have some of those, but others you'll actually adjust. And we may not always be able to change, but a double mistake is when we don't try to really learn from these mistakes. And then finally, we should acknowledge that many innovations are the results of failures. They're byproducts that solve other problems. And we need to learn that even within our failures, there may be elements that are really successful. And so we just can't write off the entire experience. I remember in our Denver workforce initiative, from a results side, it didn't really work, but they created some of the best job readiness training tools that have now circulated around the country for different folks. So you need to pay attention to that. So mistakes to success in sum is a small initial effort to share and learn about mistakes in the nonprofit sector. We know there's a whole treasure trove of mistakes out there waiting to be discovered and learned from, but there's also a great big monster, all that fear that's preventing us from getting to the treasure trove. And we hope this book will encourage more sharing to open that up. In the next couple months, we plan to develop some of these tools and make them more available, the pre-mortem, some of the techniques we've learned in terms of having mistakes, potlucks as we call them. We also want to create some kind of web presence for talking about mistakes and figuring out another way to capture some of these mistake stories more effectively so others can take a look at them. And we'd appreciate kind of your ideas on how we might proceed with that. So thank you for listening, and now we'll hear a couple mistake stories. And the first one up is
Bob.
El Mercado from Bob Brehm. He doesn't have to stand up here, though, right?
Okay.
Unless he wants to.
Thanks. And I want to add thanks to Bob and the Casey Foundation for sponsoring this project. I really enjoyed the opportunity to reflect on my own personal work and also to be involved in this discussion about something I think is really important to our collective work in general. And from 1978 through the mid-90s, I was with a group called Bickerdike Redevelopment in Chicago. It was a community development corporation. In the classic sense, it was started by an Alinsky-style organizing group that was one of the first organizing groups in Chicago. The community was one of about 150,000 people, Westtown Humboldt Park in Chicago's near northwest side. During the years I was there, predominantly Latino and African American. Housing and commercial areas just devastated by abandonment and arson and slumlords, and the rapidly declining disparity between real incomes and what things cost to do well. A lot of crime in the neighborhood, graduation rates at the local high school from incoming freshmen, maybe 20-25% of them finished high school. A lot of gang crimes, real dearth of health services. You just go on and on. That was the community we worked in, and we loved it. That was our mission, and that's why we were there. During the time I was there, we grew from a staff of like 2 or 3 with some volunteers to over 50 people. Community-controlled board and staff. Everybody was residents of the local area almost entirely. I was the last white Anglo non-Hispanic staff person there when I left in '95. So we kept up a real activist beat. People knew us and I think respected us both for our capacity to do projects and the fact that we didn't turn away from our activist roots like so many CDCs had sort of taken a more conservative turn, especially during the Reagan years. Not everybody liked us or me personally, and we got under people's skin and whatnot, but there was a lot of respect. We built hundreds of units of affordable housing. We started a construction company that did succeed, actually. And
I resent that.
We were funded from the same grant program.
now he really resents it.
And if I don't get to it during my intro, let's come back to that later, because the reason we succeeded where the other one didn't, I think one of the reasons is very telling and something we don't give enough consideration to. We did a commercial building for our own offices and a infant mortality clinic downstairs. So we had a lot under our belts. In all of our work, we insisted that we were not about doing real estate development. We were about doing community development that benefited the low-income residents of our community. If we could do a housing project that wasn't going to be accessible or affordable to residents of our community, we turned it down. And that was somewhat unique at the time and may still be somewhat unique today. We're not the only group that ever did that. But we were steadfast in the notion that we were doing this as part of a process of empowering people through collective struggle and empowering people through economic opportunities, whether that's housing or jobs. On the job sides, we insisted that private contractors we hired on the housing development work had to hire half their people from the community. We had a great deal of success with those kinds of agreements. We created the construction company, which hired and trained local women and minorities. And at the time, in the construction trades of Chicago, those were pretty rare to find. We used to have a saying that anybody with a decent construction job didn't need a subsidized apartment. In fact, they made too much to be eligible for it. So in the 80s, as all the housing money was drying up, we started to look more and more about jobs and job loss. We worked actually alongside of the Harold Washington administration, Bob was there, in trying to fight some of the factory closings in our community that were the direct result of the encroachment of rapidly gentrifying real estate development, loft conversions, that kind of thing. And we searched for a way that we could intervene in the local economy, just as we had in housing. We didn't just advocate for affordable housing and organize against displacement, which we did, but we actually intervened by buying property and renovating or building new property to increase the supply of it. Shouldn't we be able to take that approach over to the job side and create jobs or income opportunities for local people in the community? Didn't we have the skills and the resources and the capacity and the commitment to do that? And after a lot of searching and community planning, we focused on doing a public marketplace. And for those of you who know, Chicago has no history in modern times of this indoor market with separate vendors and small booths selling essentially fresh and prepared foods. DC has one over at Eastern Market. Baltimore has several and a long history of them. Philadelphia, New York, other cities have them. And they're a regular part of the market for foodstuffs in those communities. Chicago did not have one. But most of our residents of our community were from Latin American countries, Puerto Rico and Mexico primarily, where they were a big part. Everybody in our community, it seemed like everybody you talked to, all of the Latinos, had either shopped at mercados when they were growing up or their parents had. And it just seemed like the perfect thing for a community where the big supermarkets weren't accessible. You had to take a couple of bus rides to get to them. So we found a site, and it was actually a decaying, decrepit supermarket in 18,000 square feet right down the street from our office. And his lease was up and he was going to close it down. This guy had about 4 or 5 stores in Chicago, and they were all dirty and smelly and not much in fresh foods. You can all picture those kind of small supermarkets. And so we took it over and we renovated it into this incredibly beautiful place with artwork and murals led by a community artist and with local youth involved in doing it. Inside was open and airy with skylights and cafes that you could eat Mexican and Puerto Rican and Jamaican food from. And we had local residents operating some of the booths, and it was colorful, and it was just the brightest thing on the commercial strip, and it failed miserably. And about 4 years later, as I was leaving, I left the organization in '95, and the woman who took my place took a hard look at it and did not have the sentimental attachment to it, didn't have all of the double time months and years working on this project that I had and the dream and the vision of this thing being what it could be. She took a hard look at it, and we were losing thousands of dollars a month, and most of the vendors had left, and people weren't coming to shop there, and she said, we can't keep doing this. And so they found a mid-sized Latino businessman who had like 2 or 3 other markets in Chicago, not in our own neighborhood. He leases the space and has ever since, what are we talking, almost 15 years now he's leased the space. Bickerdike is getting repaid for its investment. There is a local business who hires local people, providing fresh fruits and vegetables and other things that the local community wants. Does that represent a mission shift where they sold out and rationalized a change in the project? I don't really think so. It's not like they brought in, I'm getting some feedback.
He'll adjust.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay? I can take it off if that's...
Do that.
It's not like we brought in Bloomingdale's, to facilitate more rapid gentrification on the block, which some people might have tried to do just to get our money back on the real estate. they changed it in a way that made sense. What it didn't have was the what it didn't have was the micro enterprise that we set out to do. We set out to have all of these booths owned and operated by lower income people from the community. That was the idea. And then they would in turn hire local residents. That didn't work out. Why did we go ahead in spite of that? I don't know. We opened with about 40% of the booths rented. Some of them operated by us from day one. And then we took over those that closed. Did we not challenge our own assumptions carefully enough? Yes. But the supermarket that was there before was making a good buck. And we figured that if we could make even 30 or 40% of the gross that he took in, we could be a success. We never made more than 10 or 15% of what he pulled in. Why? People didn't want to shop there. Maybe their connections to the Plaza Mercado was a sentimental, romantic one from the old country, and nowadays they really wanted to go to supermarkets where you could use credit cards and pay for everything at once, and they had all of the dry goods and frozen goods. We didn't even have a freezer. There was going to be no frozen food in this place. You're laughing. No lottery. You couldn't buy cigarettes or alcohol. We had a guy with a magazine rack. He had to turn down the men's magazines. I mean, we had some rules for this place, you know. And we were full of this vision, and I take full responsibility for that. And I don't know if it was a sort of hubris or organizational machismo. I don't know if it was a personal one, because we worked our tails off to make this work. But we believed that we would pull it off. We had had other struggles. Some of our housing was violently opposed. You know, they torched some of our buildings when it was under construction. We didn't let that stop us. Why should we let a little thing like nobody to rent our booths stop us from doing Mercado? And it's foolish, and it sounds funny now, and I don't know how. We weren't that stupid, you know? But we did believe in ourselves, and we believed in this vision and didn't challenge that enough, and we should have. We also had raised a lot of resources from our housing development work, and that's another story where we got sort of lucky or fortunate on some of that and raised some development fees. So when banks turned us down on the Mercado, we had to raise matching funds to the federal grants we got. We just self-funded our share, our half of the $2.5 million. Well, maybe the bank's involvement would have added a level of risk assessment that we didn't apply to ourselves. We were so sure of ourselves. When a young couple came in and said they wanted to open a booth that sold baby goods, well, it wasn't on our original list, but we had allowed for some dry goods or specialty shops, and so we said, okay. We didn't challenge their assumptions about how many people would come in to buy baby supplies, and they were wrong, and almost nobody did. So we failed for a lot of reasons like that. Is the project now a failure? No. I think it is seen as a community success, and I'm very proud of what the group did after my departure in doing that. When I was asked to write an article for this, I did check with Joy, the current director, out of deference and respect for her leadership, because I know if I was in her shoes, I would want to know about this too and how it was being characterized. And I was very careful to lay it out for her as I'm talking about the earlier failure converted to success, and the whole point of the book is about constructive mistakes and all that stuff, and she was fine with it, and she even contributed some information and a couple of quotes to the process. And I think maybe the group learned from that too. But it's not something they go around. It's not part of, if you go on their website, they don't say, here's this project that failed and now it's doing great. They don't call it a mistake. And but I do. I still think of it as that. It didn't work as it was. My time is up, and maybe in questions and answers we can touch on a couple other things. Thanks very much.
Yeah, we want to let Neil describe his daycare project briefly, just in 5 minutes or so.
So first I'll start by saying it was really interesting listening to Bob rattle off all the signs of mistakes, including the over-complexity and the need for better feasibility study. And I have to say that we hit all of them in this project that I'm going to tell you about. And the one mistake I don't think we did is that our executive director, Diane Bayerjan, and Bill Grinker at the time did not shy away from talking about this, which is why I still had a job and why I'm here today to talk to you about this. So let me tell you a little bit about SeedCo and the community child care initiative that they put together and put it in context, which is, it's very similar to the other projects in the book in the sense that it's really taking an innovation and bringing it to scale in the social service sector. But it's, I think, quite different in the sense that it's very much in the camp of a social enterprise. So it tries to address a social problem, but actually make a real profit on it. And I think it's interesting to look at the whole field of social enterprise because it's very emblematic of this whole notion of mistakes and the difficulty of addressing them within the nonprofit sector. Because if you look at social enterprise, I think a lot of it is born from foundations and others putting pressure on nonprofits to be innovative, to create something new, to make money and to create revenue. And there are many mistakes within the field of social enterprise, but it's hard to find them because there's a lot of hype about the field. And when you scratch below the surface, which we did when we put together, is actually a policy report that led to the chapter in the book. When you really look at the field, we didn't find one example, looking in New York and across the country, of a social enterprise that truly generated money and addressed a social problem at the same time. And certainly there are examples of Goodwill that run thrift stores where it's a separate business that then feeds into the parent. And then there are others that have some of their profits from self-generating revenue, but not completely self-sustaining. And then there are others like Greyston Bakery in Yonkers, but there are hidden costs there that we started to find when we looked at them in terms of grants that they receive from foundations or the public sector, paying workers minimum wage in connection to criminal justice programs, things that make sense on the books, but in terms of actually being a pure for-profit entity don't quite pan out. But Seedco tried to do this. So then you have to ask, what kind of organization is Seedco? And it's a very large nonprofit, and it's unique in many respects in the sense that it receives a fair amount of grants and soft money from foundations and large grants from the public sector. So they have the luxury and soft dollars to experiment. And then they also hire a staff that's very entrepreneurial. So given that their work is very much focused on human services and workforce, it's surprising that most of the people who work there have business degrees, have management degrees, and very few MSWs or social work degrees or social workers within the organization. So a very entrepreneurial place. And then at the time that they did the postmortem on this effort, they brought me, and I was running an independent policy group in New York, a little like a Brookings or an Aspen, but I was the type, I hired all journalists to work at my group, so I was really believed in this machismo of independence and telling the story as it is. And I said, are you sure that you really want to do this? And they said yes, with some trepidation. But they sort of let me and some of my colleagues go at it and take a look at the effort. And so essentially what the effort was is it grew out of not really a social enterprise, but an entrepreneurial approach to human services that they called Earn Fair. And this grew in the mid-1990s in welfare reform, when there were a lot of for-profit companies that started coming into the scene to take advantage of welfare reform. And Seedco said, why can't we create a managed network where Seedco functions as a hub and works with many community groups so that community groups can stay in business but actually have the scale and the services needed to go toe-to-toe with some of the more private groups entering the field. And it worked quite successfully. And so Earn Fair was an organization that successfully competed for a lot of the contracts in the welfare to work era in the 1990s in the Giuliani administration in New York. But what they found is that a lot of people had difficulty sustaining jobs because of absenteeism. And then they said, well, what are the reasons for that? And they did focus groups, mainly in the Bronx, with workers and with businesses, and they found a lot of people had childcare situations, some of them long-term, but a lot of them were emergency situations that came up. Kid is sick, mom is sick, dad is sick, can't get the kids to daycare or to school, and they need help in that for a day or for a couple of days. And so they said, how is it that we can address the situation? And then so all that entrepreneurial energy, and they were caught up in the whole social enterprise movement as well, that all kicked in. And so they got a little bit of foundation money to do a planning grant. They started working with Columbia Business School, and they mapped out a whole business plan. And their plan was that they would create emergency backup childcare that foundations or government wouldn't pay for, but they believed they could sell it to the private sector, to employers. And their focus would be in the Bronx, excuse me, and rather than working with what's called center-based care, they would work with family-based care, which are the thousands of sort of individuals, typically low to moderate income women, that run family-based care where they'll have 5 slots, but they're licensed and it's quality care, and they usually have 1 to 2 to 3 open slots. So there's all this slack capacity. It's very affordable. And so they set up a network with the family care providers. They started signing on a couple of businesses to do it, and they launched the effort. It failed. And the thing that's interesting about this is that I think unlike many of the conversations that we're having today about mistakes, this was a failure. And again, when you start looking at social enterprise, many of the social enterprises are actually beyond mistakes, they're failures. And they went into this with a head of steam, thinking it would be a win-win for everybody, because the low to moderate income women running the family care centers would benefit. They'd get more business. The workers would benefit with the emergency child care. The employers would benefit as they pitched it to them, and as they said, the employer said to them in the focus group, we need some help to bring down our turnover rates. So it just seemed as though it would work so well. They worked with Columbia Business School and got their imprint on it, and they went off. Well, so the reasons it failed were, one, is they launched the business right after 9/11. So not only was the economy turning in New York, but there was really more than that, a fear out there that gripped the city and a fear that gripped employers. And the other issue is that almost everything they heard in the focus group turned out not to be true in reality. So they talked to the businesses, and the businesses said, well, yes, we said we needed this in the focus group, but now it's 9/11. That was one. Two, they said most of the need that we have are for those workers that do the overnight shifts. And your family-based centers are great, but they don't really provide child care, you know, from midnight until 6 in the morning. But really what it was is the employers just did not want to take advantage of the service, even though they said so in the focus group. And the parents who said that they wanted during the focus group said, well, now that we actually have to do this, it's a whole rigmarole to even get into the network, because they have to have sort of doctors sign off and medical certification in order to even have their child and them enrolled in the program. And they also, truth be told, had their own backup. So if an emergency came up, that's what they said in the focus group, but they could always put the kid with grandma for the day. And the other issue was that a lot of these family-based centers were in public housing projects. That's where they were run. So a lot of times the parents would say, get on the subway. So actually they would have to get on the subway, go a couple stops in the other direction, and then be in a public housing project where they didn't feel comfortable leaving their kid even for the day. So again, the reality was very different than what they had heard. And so then Seacoast started to scramble and say, we need an anchor client in order to carry us through and prove this out and to reach scale. And they assumed that they would get one, and they didn't. So they started negotiating with the local HRA agency and the Human Resource Administration. And because it was in the midst of welfare reform, there was a lot of back and forth, and the terms did not work out well. They were not able to execute a successful contract. They started working with a lot of major employers, hospitals, but those were unionized, and unions didn't take to this model very well. They had a lot of questions. They were not able to work through it. So the anchor client didn't come. And then after running this for 3 years, they met with their board. They had formed a separate subsidiary and board for this, and they decided to pull the plug. And so the whole effort was shut down. Now, they did form relationships with 4 employers. They wound up serving over 2,000 children, but it clearly wasn't something that could be sustainable as a business, and that's how it was set up. So very quickly, the postmortem that we had, and it really reads as though like a bit of a, I'm embarrassed to say, punch list from what Bob said at the beginning of the day, but we really felt that pressure, that complexity internally as an organization to do so much. There was such ambition that every time you saw another sort of cohort or client who could benefit from this, we would add it on. Oh, the family-based center and the women that are running this program, that's great. We're doing it for them. We're doing it for the children themselves that'll actually get certified, licensed care. And that was more of the orientation in terms of serving these multiple goals rather than focusing and picking one goal, let alone the one about making money. There was also the issue of, of running a social enterprise, but having to run it like a nonprofit. So it was incredibly, when you look at private businesses and startups, incredibly undercapitalized. So they really started the whole venture with a few $100,000, where most new ventures like this that try to reach scale, you know, in a place like New York City of 8 million people and 5 boroughs with $200,000 is just completely untenable. And the short timeline. So when 9/11 occurred, a lot of businesses would say, well, let's pull back, let's talk to our investors and backers, but they had grants, you know, midterm reports, end-year reports to write. They felt as though they couldn't step back from those obligations to the private grant makers, so that they had to forge ahead with the timeline and launch the effort in a hostile environment. And the last thing I would mention is that there was a lot of confusion in terms of customers and clients. So when you looked at the workers, a lot of the women they were trying to serve, their need for childcare was very real as a client, but not as a customer. And the workers had a very real need to reduce turnover as a client, but as a customer, they weren't willing to take advantage of this kind of service. And so the final piece I would say in conclusion is I am happy to say, as is an organization, and Bob is now on the board of Seedco, so maybe you've helped to institutionalize this, that we've adopted some of the suggestions of the book. So we've certainly learned from the mistakes. Seedco is no longer launching purely for-profit endeavors. There's a much more cautious approach to efforts that try and create self-generating revenue. There's very much a pre-mortem that takes place, so there's an extensive array of risk analysis that happens before Seedco gets involved in any new endeavor. And there's very much that potluck, which happens every week at Seedco. There's a senior staff meeting that is more focused, honestly, on mistakes and failure because the organization is so risky than it is in terms of, congratulating one another on the mistakes that they've made. And what I'm very happy to say is that the organization is no less entrepreneurial in any way and very much takes advantage of, I think, the luxury that they have of being a very well-funded, large nonprofit to try new things, to be risky, to make mistakes, but again, to learn from them and not to sort of have this recognition of the mistakes publicly through this report and through the book be something that prevents them from doing more ambitious work.
Great. Thanks so much, Neil. So I'm just going to ask you guys a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for you all. But I think these are both really rich stories, and I think in your closing there, you touched on a number of the questions that I just wanted to explore a little bit more with you. And the one I was just thinking when you're talking about this is sort of this tension between planning and implementation. And a lot of times we get these sort of planning grants and we make the plan and then we go implement it. And when we're implementing, that can be the source of great learning, but yet we're busy implementing and not learning. And so I'm just wondering if you could reflect on, in the case of the childcare one, in fact, it seemed like as things went wrong, you went even faster. Rather than sort of taking a step back and trying to think about, well, what is this really telling us and how do we redirect? And I'm just wondering if you could both sort of reflect a little bit on sort of that experience and what could go maybe a little bit differently in another project with respect to learning from your implementation as well as just doing the plan.
I would say quickly that I think the whole idea of trying to speed up is in fact what happened, and it was the wrong approach because in the moment there was a feeling as though we were learning from mistakes. This wasn't working, let's take a different approach. It's actually not reaching scale in the Bronx, so let's go to scale in the 4 boroughs. Because one of the reasons it wasn't reaching scale is that people who actually were working in the Bronx, surprisingly, were commuting from Yonkers or from Brooklyn, and so we felt as though we needed more of these family-based sites in other parts of the borough. But that desire to try and address the problem in the moment quickly precluded us from having that broader sense of the whole effort wasn't working in some fundamental ways.
2 parts. The first one is the pre-mortem or stress test from engineering. The bridge engineer doesn't build it with untested materials or joinery and wait till the cars start falling off to go back and add more support. We should develop some sense in our work of being able to do that. If it's not hard data, at least anecdotal. There are very few anecdotes out there like these that we're talking about really what failed and how did it break down. We can learn from those and use them in our pre-mortems. Secondly, some of the changes we can make before we start. The Mercado should not have opened with 30% of the booths rented. We should have said we want to hurry up and open and build on our momentum, but you know what? We can open in the spring. It won't kill us. And better to open in the spring with 60% rented than now. We thought they would all come afterwards. Lousy assumption, and we just raced to do it. Some things shouldn't happen. Other things can be fixed as we go. They're not all global problems. I've worked with groups where they just weren't seeing the individual trees for worrying about the forest coming down all around them. And there were plenty of those individual things, particularly in affordable housing. Things can be fixed, and that relieves some of the financial and personal stress on the people involved and makes a turnaround more possible. If we apply some of these principles very early on, hopefully even before we get started, Neil mentioned the anchor employer. We should have had an anchor tenant in this Mercado. We rejected it. Why? We wanted to emphasize that local micro-enterprise, local economic benefit as much as possible. There's a CDC in Hartford that did a mercado, did a marketplace, and they leased half of it to a grocer. We ended up trying that, but by the time we tried it, it was way too late. So you compromise a little bit. You get a minority business person to operate half of it and have groceries that people want, and you form a ring around that grocer with independent cafes and ethnic produce and things like that, have a chance to succeed. We could have made that call early on if we had considered it. Sometimes you've got to do something different. If it's a sellout, don't do it. But if it's a different way to do it and you can still achieve some of those goals, maybe that can be some place we start from, not clamor after later when we're failing.
You know, one of the things, the chapter I wrote on site selection, one of the things we did for our jobs initiative, we had a design and we were just about to go out and look for sites, and somehow we did a very smart thing. We retained a Corporation for Enterprise Development to do a simulation of the local site. We brought in city council people, chambers, nonprofit providers, a whole array of folks, and they chewed on the design, how it would work in their locale. And it really turned around the whole design. And so that kind of simulation approach where you're trying to figure out how does this play out on the ground, what do actors really feel about it, was very, very helpful.
Great. I wanted to go to one more question that I wanted to comment on, because you both have touched on this issue of funding constraints and you know, you need to get to your funder, you need to do your deadlines. I know, Bob, in your paper you talked about, you know, who's eligible to participate and those kinds of things that were in your funding. And I'm just curious, and if you feel like you missed opportunities, you know, how firm were those constraints really? Did you miss opportunities to reopen discussions with your funders? Or with, you know, how much of that was driving sort of sticking to the original plan and let's just keep going or go faster? And I'm curious also, Bob, on your perspective in terms of, you know, what you think in terms of, from a funder perspective, when you would want somebody to come to you and say, let's re-talk about this, and you know, when you want to stick to your original constraints and when not, if you want to comment on that.
We sought and won 2 grants, Health and Human Services and EDA, which were both definitely restricted to low-income benefit. We could have written those grants differently. We could have written those grants to a moderate income area or minority business person leasing half the space surrounded by low income businesses. We didn't. Mm-hmm. We pitched those numbers. We wanted to be competitive in the grant process, and that's what we won. When it came time when the project was failing, we went back, or they did after I left, and negotiated with EDA, which was the only one that still had any control, and they were totally fine with this thing. And the group still reports on the number of jobs and economic opportunities created there. So on the one hand, it was a strict, limited program, but it matched what we were looking to do. So I don't think that did it. Uh-huh. I know other groups, though, even without program limits, are very wary of approaching a funder. The big developers, when they can't pay their mortgage, they don't pay their mortgage anyways. They go back in and talk to those lenders, the big private developers. Somehow community groups think, oh no, we have to cut staff, we can't pay the community organizer or the social service provider, we've got to pay that mortgage. They wouldn't dream of going in and talking to a lender or an investor. And some of these lenders are the good guy lenders. The groups are the CRA branches of banks that were set up to assist in community development. And we're way too timid about going back and saying, this isn't working for any of us, let's figure out another way to do it and restructure it.
Daniel, you want to comment?
Well, I would just say quickly, I think sometimes there's a real fear of approaching funders when things aren't working out, and most of the groups that succeed don't have that issue because they realize that the funders would appreciate knowing when it's not working out and that there's real flexibility built in. And I think Seedco felt the same way, but really, it's one of those issues of apples and oranges. It was the project that we were talking about was built to be a for-profit, and it needed tremendous subsidy, and that's not how the original grants were written. So nothing probably would have really worked. And I think you see that a lot of times in sort of our field as well, that it has maybe not to do with a social enterprise. People write grants to form a network, and then you find that there aren't enough people who are interested in being in the network, or there's some very difficult people in the network, and it's better to have a smaller group. How do you go back to the funder on that? The parameters are really around it being a network proposal, and then if it's not working, then that has to be admitted as well.
I would say we have, there's one example of a nonprofit check casher that we've been investing in the West Coast. And this is like this, Irene and I, who's here, work on this. And the guy's a terrific entrepreneur. He's 3 years behind, drawing down money and everything else. It's finally starting to look like it might work. But we've really, in this case anyway, really talked, and it's switched locations, and it's switched this, and switched that. And you need to have that kind of interaction around entrepreneurial stuff. Now, if we didn't have the faith in the entrepreneur, it might not have worked. It also wasn't quite as central and have as much, wasn't in the limelight of Casey Investments, so it could be over here and we could kind of play with it. But it still takes that kind of time. And I've been surprised. He said, you know, that you're one of the few funders that comes out and actually talks to me, which was, you know, really a condemnation, I think, of a lot of social investing and philanthropy if you're not talking to your grantees, because I think you've got to be partners in this. It's not about, you know, distance.
Yeah. Great. I think that comes a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, both case studies seem to have evolved. Both case studies seem to have involved a number of goals. So instead of, maybe that's overcomplicating the process. Like if you had one goal, as you mentioned, bringing in retail, commercial, grocery store, and stuck with that idea instead of saying, then I needed this goal accomplished, you know, minority ownership. I need this goal with trying to bring in for the child care. Instead of just directly providing child care, it came in the wrong time, the wrong place. Is it simpler, as was mentioned by Bob in his beginning comments, to just have one goal and meet it? Because sometimes there's incompatibility.
Yeah, it'd be simpler, it'd be nice. We make our lives harder for ourselves. Thank you very much. On the other hand, we're in it to achieve those goals. Now, maybe that made that particular project infeasible from the get-go, and we should have recognized that and realized that these goals are not only overlapping, but maybe contradictory, and either adjusted our approach or dropped that one and found another place where we could really push for that community benefit and not be at odds with ourselves. But to say, couldn't we do better if we had simplified it to one goal? I'm not sure in our context that would have worked. Could they have said, we'll do this, but we're not going to do it in the Bronx? No. I mean, they set out to do it in what turns out, a very difficult, if I could say so, a difficult place to do it. They weren't going to go out to the suburbs, to White Plains to do this. It's not what made sense. It might have succeeded had they dropped that goal of where they were going to do it. So sometimes these goals are central to why we're doing it in the first place.
I have failed in my moderator responsibility. Please wait for the microphone to come. Nancy? So, yeah.
Neil, you mentioned that the focus groups that you did, you know, the information that you received indicated one thing and supported going forward with the project and all that. And then in the reality, you know, it's like, would really people, here's the program, are you going to sign up? It was no. So that's very disconcerting. What lessons can we learn about structuring focus groups, or, you know, I hear what you said, Bob, about simulating, but, you know, what can we learn from that failure?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think that it's sort of called into question a lot of how CEDCO operates, because CEDCO functions very much around focus groups. And they feel as though that makes a lot of their efforts bulletproof, because here it is, you're actually talking to the clients and getting multiple perspectives, not just the workers, but the businesses as well. But again, as we've been saying, it's not enough to hear it. You actually have to begin administering the program. And the other thing I would say, and it goes back to the last point, that if the focus were on just one of the clients or customers, we might have succeeded. So if we're just on that parent that needs the child care, maybe. If it were just on that business, maybe. If it were just on the family care center owner, maybe. If it were just on the child that needs more quality care, maybe. There were four cohorts we tried to address from one round of focus groups. So that's not enough to base it on. Clearly, I think the focus group was legitimate in identifying an issue, but the execution was too disparate and ambitious?
You know, this is an interesting question because I think, and Bob, you bring it up explicitly, I think there's also this question of how much you can research and how much you just need to bring in terms of experience. I mean, you talk explicitly in your paper about, well, we had experience doing property development and various things, but we didn't really have food service experience, and we were going to run a food business. And I don't know if anybody on the staff at Seedco had actually run a daycare before or really had experience in providing daycare services. But I'm wondering if that's also something to think about, is sort of the staff capacities that you need when you think about starting one of these
That's a good
things.
point.
If you want to.
You know, also, I wonder whether, I mean, like Bob said, you could have got buy-in from employers or customers before you started off, whether there was some threshold of,
That's right.
I mean, oftentimes this focus group stuff, the only way to get through it is sort of say, put up some money.
Yeah.
You get a
And then you'll
commitment
find
better than just
the commitment, and that'll cut through a lot of stuff.
Okay. Stephen?
Following up on the focus group question, which I found intriguing too, and I didn't think was emphasized in the book, but there's a wonderful exhibit right now at the National Museum of American History with a bunch of photographs of the development by a company whose name I don't recall, trying to develop a better baby carriage, a better stroller, actually. And they decided not to do focus groups, and they explain this in the exhibit. They decided to go out and watch how people use strollers. And they use strollers to carry a lot of goods. And they use strollers for all sorts of things besides what you might intuitively think of. and they have all sorts of problems,
Been
it
there.
curbs, et cetera. So it was, I don't know how you apply that to the more, I mean, it's a little harder to watch daycare or childcare or whatever we're talking about here. Mikado, I guess you could have gone to Hartford, Bob, and looked at what they were doing there and how, but
They did.
yeah. And I would just add to that, if you think about the innovator's dilemma and the whole argument about the innovator's dilemma, if you're acquainted with it, one of the downfalls for successful companies when it comes to disruptive innovations is that they are paying so much attention to what their big customers want in the way of improvement. So mini-frame computers by Digital General, or one of the big companies, it was very hard for them to develop PCs because their main customers weren't interested in PCs. They were interested in bigger capacity. So they missed that market and they failed in the end as a firm. Anyway, thoughts?
You can hand it to the woman right next to you.
Yeah.
Oh, go. Did you want to comment?
I think that innovation is something we should and need to be encouraging. Unlike for-profit business, whose really only goal is that profit. I mean, there are nice guy for-profit businesses and all, Ben and Jerry's, you can find examples of that, but if they've got to make a profit and they have a certain flexibility to follow where that innovation takes them. We don't necessarily have that flexibility. I don't care much for the workforce development group that sets out to do union construction jobs and ends up doing McDonald's jobs just to get its numbers up. I mean, that's not innovation to me. So how do we set up these enterprises, whether they're social for-profit enterprises or initiatives of a foundation or nonprofit activities, set them up in such a way where there's a chance that they can succeed or be continually funded to proceed so that we can actually test those innovations and see if they're working. Did the Mercado fail because the innovation was wrong? No, I think it was a bad idea to begin with. Were they lacking innovation at Seedco? I don't know. Maybe some of their innovations were off base, and maybe some deserve to be tested again. And unfortunately, due to these catastrophic failures, we don't really get to test that out.
Okay, one of the things I was looking at, and as I was listening to both of your companies and what you were talking about, your enterprises, one of the things I wanted to know is who went into the communities? Who went into the communities themselves, you know, because my thing is, if you're going to give me something, I need somebody like me to come into the community and to observe what's going on. I listened to your idea. Your ideas were great, but they were your ideas. You didn't ask me, even if you had a focus group. Even if you
we were a group of community people. We
Right,
had
but-
local residents and businesses were part of the entire planning
But the thing
process.
is, when I listen to what you're talking about, all this came from your head. And the thing is, it's like, the thing for me is, it's like, I'm in the minority and you're telling me that you're going to do daycare and everything like this, but nobody's coming into the community. You have this grand idea about what you want to do to help me, but you're not coming into the community like the carrot story. You're not coming into the community and really observing what's going on and the other pieces that you might need in order to make it a success for me and for you, because you wanted to make a profit. You could have made a profit, but I needed you to care about what was going on. Did you know which generation was it? Was it Generation X? Was it Generation Y? What generation were you trying to reach? Just because we have child care issues, I'm in a different kind of mindset than that young girl that's 18 or 19 years old. So there are pieces that you needed to help me get to understand what you're trying to do and assist me.
Can I piggyback on that? I had two comments. What I think she meant was, ask me for what I need. And I liked it that you did the focus group, but they could not, for whatever reason, tell you, be honest enough with you. And I like surveys or other things that I can give you my honest opinion anonymously. So the site that you were talking about putting up to get people to contribute, I know that you will have triple amount of people helping if they don't have to sign on who they are or the company that they failed with. And I think that was very important. And also, I like the stroller idea because you can ask me questions, or I may give you the answer that I think you want to hear, but when you observe me, like they did with the stroller, you have the answer there. And I think it should have been a couple of ways to gather the information and to compare where it was done, the entrepreneurial market, where it was done, and also that store linking, no matter what mall or whatever, they have a history of having a store there that will draw people automatically. And I think that would have been a good idea with the market. If you have a store there or a business there that you know that people will come to, whether it's an entrepreneurial or independent business who developed a chain or something, then people tend to come to that store, which will give everybody in the area a chance to get some of that money. But
Do you want to comment on
that? Being able to contribute without saying my name is Jane and I work for this company may give you more information if it's anonymous.
You know, it's interesting. One of the chapters is on defining workforce outcomes, kind of how you're doing, and it's about our jobs initiative. And what we found was lots of community-based organizations really didn't want to share because they felt the same kind of fear that they would get punished. And that led us to invest in a project with public-private ventures to create an anonymous website where people could put in their data and you could get back information about how you're doing compared to others, but and do your own interpretation and improvement. And it gets really at that issue.
Right.
It's
and you know,
an interesting
with
point.
People are really thinking about child care no matter where they are in the economic, you know, they could be scale. They could be the poorest of poor or the richest of rich. People are very funny about who they like to take care of their kids, even if they need it in an emergency situation. They're really very
Particular.
very particular, and they won't tell you because for whatever reason.
It's their kids.
Yeah.
Hi there. My question was about the sort of on both of the projects you talked about. I was wondering if the project had an evaluation component attached to it, or on an ongoing basis post, design phase, because it seems to me like sort of integrating that from the get-go might have been helpful in sort of informing the work going forward. And then I was wondering if, Bob, you could comment on sort of funders' support of that type of activity that can help, very passionate and dedicated folks that are working on the ground to bring about change, to kind of be armed with information they need to make good decisions as they do their work.
building evaluation from the beginning, spoken like a true evaluator? Any comments on that?
I am only a little bit embarrassed to say that I led that group for 17 years, and since then I've been involved in this online certificate of nonprofit management, teaching strategic management. And it wasn't until I left my position there that I learned how to write an actual outcome objective, let alone describe to you any kind of evaluation planning cycle. I understood it intuitively. There was no commitment to it. Evaluations were things you filled out on quarterly reports for funders and said, you know, are you likely to achieve your outcomes by the deadline? If not, what steps are you taking? Those 2 sentences are on every form. And that was evaluation. We did an annual retreat, but, you know, we didn't do it. We lived it every day. We asked ourselves hard questions. We made changes, but we didn't really understand and appreciate that process.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up sort of a little bit this difference between sort of, and you mentioned it a couple times, you know, the difference between doing it internally yourself versus having somebody who brings more of an external perspective to facilitate
Maybe
that.
a little objectivity.
So, yeah.
So that's the other person because you're the program person.
Yeah. Did you want to comment on that, Bob or Neil?
You know, I had 2 comments. I mean, one thing in community development, you don't tend to have as much evaluation. It's kind of project by project. So I think that's an issue. You know, at one point, we didn't get as many practitioners, people on the ground doing stuff. I mean, Bob was one. We got a few others. We had 2 or 3 sign up, and they just didn't have the space while they were actually trying to do things on the ground to reflect and write this up. So I think it's a good challenge for us as we go forward. If we want to get practitioners into that, we've got to help create some space and resource for them to do that. Good.
Okay, we can have one more here.
I'm Jeff Nugent with the Center for Leadership Innovation, and I'd really like to build on this last point because I think what you're talking about here is truly revolutionary within the social sector. If we could muster the political will or the courage to do it, the magnitude of the issues faced by our society on so many different fronts, whether it's incarceration, education, just go down the list. The numbers, I'm sure we all know them in the room, are so dramatic. And in most cases, they're not actually getting better. And, but what is the practice in philanthropy in the United States is 90% fund programs, fund defined programs, give the report, have the nonprofit, you know, report back that it's working and apply for the next grant, as opposed to the assumption that we're going to undertake the experiments, the pilot testing of hypotheses, which we're going to learn from, and which we assume from the start we do not have the right answer. And the innovative process is going to require iteration, and it's going to require feedback and perspectives from people from different vantage points, be it the community, be it government, be it the private sector, be it practitioners. It's when you really step back from the question that I think you're broaching here, it's revolutionary for the entire sector. And we're so, I mean, and it's even, I mean, I think there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek even in the title of the book. Because in real science, there are no mistakes. There are simply experiments and results and lessons learned and the next hypothesis. So there are no mistakes. I mean, really, the only mistake you can make is not learning from the results of the the phrase actually that I was most struck with, Bob, in your presentation is it's constructive mistakes. I mean, that at least sort of takes you down the road of saying, okay, let's make constructive mistakes. If possible, let's make new mistakes. But let's, you know, I'm not sure that I'm saying it very well, but it really, it's what you're talking about here, what you're surfacing is so embedded in a lack of entrepreneurial approach to solving social issues in our society, and in the impediments and the barriers to innovation in addressing what seem to be just such difficult issues. I mean, I would encourage you to take this and just blow it wide open, because we need to.
Okay, Well, thank you. I think that leads to some final closing thoughts on really, I think, how do we build on and expand on this learning from mistakes? And I don't know if you all would like to give a final thought on that as we close.
Wow, that was a great final thought. One of the things we thought about doing with the book is because we had so many stories about workforce development, that we could have started generating a set of hypotheses off of these results, mistakes that you then want to test across the field. And I think you're absolutely right that we really don't do that. We're kind of, we need to keep the entrepreneurial focus, but we need to have some overall learning game plan of what we're trying to get better at. And I don't think we don't have that. It was one of my disappointments with the Social Innovation Fund, although we've benefited from it. I don't think they've really gathered everything we learned before doing a very traditional process of solicitation. And that's a missed opportunity. So those are my final thoughts.
Okay.
Great comment.
I would say I think in the spirit of that and the evaluation comment that having evaluation is critical, and clearly Seedco and others need to do more. But I think it's more than that, and I think that's the spirit of the book as well, that this is a cultural issue, right. That culturally we have to have more of an orientation to mistakes. And it's not just have an outside evaluator come once a year, but on a monthly basis, a weekly basis, a daily basis. And everything that you do, you think about what are the mistakes that we're doing, how can we better learn from it, how can we have a perspective that is more community focused, as the examples that you gave that sort of prevent you from having those boneheaded mistakes in the moment. And if you start to bake that in and change the culture, I think you start to see that the work output is much stronger. And again, it's one of the positive things that I think I was able to see when I was at Seedco to span from the demise of this initiative to where they are now, that a lot of the things that sort of have come up as mistakes here are no longer the case because they were so, in a sense, shocked from the failure of this that it changed the culture of the organization. So it was one example that one of their more recent developments is something called earned benefits, where they better synthesize access to a whole host of different public benefit programs on computers. But the way they did it is they did a whole sort of risk analysis stress test first. And then the first thing they did is they went out and they started working with people on computers. And they just did the stroller thing and videotaped them, all those kinds of things. And it's made for a much stronger program that has actually, sustained over time.
Last word to you.
The construction company we started did not break even for the 13 years I was there after we formed it. It is hailed as a successful social enterprise, one of the few, as Neil said, examples out there. You can find it on different websites now. I don't know if they're breaking even today. There's a sort of X factor in some of the things that we call successes that isn't necessarily replicable. The X factor for that construction company was a captured market with its parent. When it lost money, its parent, the nonprofit, saved money and got cheaper construction services on its work. And we still put people to work. It never had the goal of making money. We have to consider those factors as we look at these things, instead of trying to replicate. If somebody tries to replicate that and start a construction company with no captured market, I'd say, no, don't do that. But you did it before. No, it was special circumstances. I'm not sure about Seedco's, but I know in the case of the Mercado, there was no X factor. And without that X factor, a commitment, an anchor, some room for the growth and innovation, the appropriate amount of capital, without that, maybe we got to take a harder look at some of the things we're doing. I think that part of the cultural shift is to encourage people to do that. That's not failure, to be a little less bold and as we approach these things, because the resources that we lose, sometimes we lose really good community activist groups because they fail because of the financial stresses, organizational stresses of these catastrophic failures they undergo. And we don't want to lose that activity because of this. And I think if we take a harder look at some of these initiatives from the get-go, we're serving the general field better.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I want to give our panelists a round of applause. Doing a great job. There's more in the book, and I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation about what we learned from these mistakes. So thank you so much for being here today.